That's awesome. Thank you. They actually spelled my name right, which is even better. So good morning? Still morning. Yes, good morning. Thank you for coming to the panel. We're going to make this as rapid fire as we can. But what we're going to do is two bits of bookkeeping. One will be the introduction of the panel themselves by themselves, and then I want to get to know you a little bit really quickly so we can tailor the 4,000 questions that we made a list of appropriately to what you're interested in. And if at any point you want to interject, even though we don't have a mic in the middle, just raise your hands in between the panelists answering, and we'll do our best to incorporate your comments. So I think there's, I'm supposed to raise this up and click it. There we go. So I'm going to let the guys on screen, or the guys on the panel, introduce themselves. We have a really fantastic mix of both practitioners, and ultimately folks from industry. I know many of these guys from years in the business, and I think what you're going to find is some very interesting and hopefully, in some cases, tumultuous agreement and disagreement on the topic. So why don't we just go down the line, if you guys wouldn't mind, who you are, where you're from, and ultimately, as it relates to cloud computing, what are your interests in terms of what you do on a daily from a daily perspective in your jobs, and what does it mean to you from the perspective of why you're here?
Sure. All right, so I'll begin. I'm Mark Wood with DELL, specifically the SecureWorks division of DELL. I'm representing a vendor, cloud service provider perspective, as well as an MSSP provider perspective today. And from a daily job perspective, my job is to figure out, how we actually monetize a lot of the services and a lot of the opportunities that are out there in the market for cloud security.
My name is Dov Yoran. I'm CEO of ThreatGRID. We're a small company that provides malware analysis for incident responders and malware analysts. It's a cloud-based hosted service, and we're looking at large volumes of malicious content that's found and captured and helping during these investigations. I'm also a founding member of the Cloud Security Alliance, and so helping to bring perspective of both our end users and how they're leveraging cloud, and also what we're doing as an organization at CSA.
Good morning. I'm Chris Swan, the CTO for Client Experience at UBS, and a board member for the Open Data Center Alliance. So with Client Experience, I'm looking after our strategy around web and mobile. And increasingly, those things are connecting back either through or to the cloud. And we need to take care of the security around that as it relates to things like client data and employee data.
My name is Greg Brown. I am the CTO for Cloud and Data Center Solutions at McAfee. Most of my day is spent looking at ways that we can take the technology that's been primarily designed for conventional security for infrastructure and determining ways that we can optimize that so that we can meet the equivalent levels of security and integrity as organizations are looking to adopt in cloud infrastructure and software as a service.
Hi, my name's Ian Lamont. I am an IT specialist at BMW. During my day job, I'm responsible for risk in the infrastructure, audit points within infrastructure, compliance, and as in my spare time, along with Matt, we put together and worked with the security work group of the Open Data Center Alliance from its inception.
Hi, Matt Lowth. So I'm a principal security architect at National Australia Bank in Australia. So my day job, as I said, I guess looking to measure the business's need for agility to and also make sure it's secure. So I guess from that perspective, the cloud's very interesting.
Great, and I'm Chris Hoff. My day job is at Juniper Networks, Chief Security Architect, and I spend an awful lot of time traveling around as part of that day job talking to customers across all sorts of industry verticals, but I also spend an awful lot of time at conferences talking to folks about their security concerns, also on the Cloud Security Alliance and a bunch of other stuff. But more interesting than me is you, so we want to make sure we tailor the questions so that we can actually give you some value. So if you wouldn't mind, with a show of hands, how many of you are IT specialists or in the IT field specifically? Okay, anybody from security specifically as a day job? Oh, good number of you, all right. How about from the lines of business, decision makers, that sort of thing? Okay, so all the vendors will be pouncing on you. How about service providers? All right. Oh, service provider and okay. All right. So now you get a double whammy. All right. So that's good. So we wanted to. A lot of the questions are kind of tailored around making sure we can go as deep as we need to. So we'll try to appeal to the audience. So the first question: you can't swing a dead cat without reading a magazine article or blog or getting into a Twitter argument. Which never happens, or going to a conference without the notion that cloud is more or less secure. So without adding any context to that stupid statement, can you give us an opinion, each of you, quickly, on whether or not, in general, and you can quantify it any way you want, based on your experience, is cloud more or less secure? And I'm going to bite my tongue.
So I guess I'll have first go. So look, I think it depends on what you're after. So I think the cloud has a place. I think for, say for example, an advertising site or a marketing site, I think it's perfectly secure. I think it does the job. You may not need massively sensitive information, but you need to make sure it's correct. So from that perspective, it is fine. On the flip side, if you're a military type business, it's probably not secure enough because there's lots of stuff out there that if you had compromise, people's lives are at risk. So I guess that doesn't really answer the question, but I guess it depends is the answer.
Next.
I think from my view, it's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't say one is better than the other. If you take some of the better providers of cloud, they're probably as secure as the average enterprise. If you take some enterprises, they're nowhere near as secure as some of the clouds. I think it's very difficult to compare. I think what is key is, from a consumer point, getting the visibility of what's out there. Because if you can't see, you've heard a lot from the other presenters this morning about regulation and need for the control from within the organizations. If you actually can't get that, then you don't have the confidence to go into the cloud because you can't see how secure the cloud is and how secure your part of what you want to buy from the cloud is going to be. So without that visibility, as I say, I think it's some answers yes, some answers no, more or less yes. I think the key is as a consumer of the cloud, you absolutely have to know what is secure and what isn't.
Yeah, so I think inherently less secure with high potential to be more secure. The determining factor is twofold. One is the propensity to actually look at what needs to be done to ensure integrity of your cloud infrastructure. So it's less about applying security technologies, but how do you measure and assure the integrity of what you are adopting and making sure that you have that visibility into it. The other part is about adoptability. Conventional security paradigms have led to this audit cycle and compliance cycle that almost every organization finds themselves in need of addressing. And until the technologies that implement that security and ultimately assure the integrity can address the requirements of audit and compliance, you're not going to be able to adopt it for all the applications that we'd love to offset cost and increase the agility of.
So just to make sure I understand, you're saying that security isn't the biggest roadblock, but compliance is?
I would say that, compliance is one aspect, but it's also the adoptability for your own internal objectives, like in measuring the integrity of your own business practice or your process. Even in the advertising space, you're subject to clickjacking, you're subject to brand erosion if people are putting your ads out there. And it's a combination of, can I measure that integrity? Can I be confident that my resources and applications are being delivered the way that I think and hope that they are?
So Chris, before you answer that question, from the perspective of what we do in the enterprise today, as you answer this question, cloud more or less secure, is the model that we currently apply in the enterprise, specifically to security and compliance, actually the right model in order to, when we talk about cloud computing? We talk about the move to cloud, but frame your answer within the perspective of, does what we do in security today, is it the right model by which we should actually benchmark cloud security in general?
Okay, well, for a start, we're now talking about two different things, and I think they're orthogonal. So, compliance is about achieving a set of minimum requirements, and security is a very much more varied beast. You're touching upon something that I've called the audit paradox. which is if we look at how we are doing security in the enterprise right now, we've got an awful lot of bolt-on solutions, and they're bolted on because they're easy to audit. They're standalone from the applications that they're putting controls around in such a way that somebody else outside of the application team can go along and say, I can see that something's there, I can measure it, and I can take the results from those measurements and give those to an auditor or somebody else to show that I am within compliance or that I'm attempting to be secure. Now, that's worked well within the enterprise, but it doesn't necessarily easily transpose into cloud. Going back to the original question, I think it's about security competence. So enterprises have done well at establishing levels of security competence, and they've built security teams to manage these things. And they've also got internal audit teams and compliance teams and all of that. And when you look at how secure is cloud, that's a relative question against your ability to be security competent. So if you're a one-man and his dog operation, dog optional, then getting security competent is going to be very difficult for you. So if you buy or borrow that security competence from a cloud service provider, you're a step ahead of where you were. If you're a large, sophisticated, and security competent enterprise, then getting that same level of competence from a cloud service provider may be a challenge for you.
Yeah. And so both Dov and Greg, you guys are a bit of an interesting hybrid given the other use cases, in as much as you offer security services both you offer kind of on-prem with your on-premises products as well as cloud-based services. Dov, you're not only a consumer and a provider of service, but you utilize cloud as a platform, right? So you're taking what could be very interesting sets of what an enterprise might consider important information and running on a platform with infrastructure that you may or may not own. So how does this notion of you choosing that platform and meeting your security requirements kind of align with the question we said, more or less secure?
Well, it's before answering that, just kind of dovetailing what he was saying, I think for smaller companies, it's more secure.
Why?
Full
Why?
stop. Because you don't have necessarily the infrastructure in place, the processes in place, the expenditures in place to leverage. Whereas, even from a decade ago, talking about DELL or SecureWorks or any of the other managed security service providers, you're leveraging the economies of scale, the expertise in scale, the infrastructure and everything else in scale to look at whatever process you're doing. So as a small, company and with a long tail there, I think it's a pretty straightforward. You're going to get a better level of security than you would have as an internal organization trying to develop yourself with a part-time IT security guy when he's got 6 other real IT jobs to do ahead of that.
So we'll come back to that a little later in terms of responsibility and what services you can expect from your provider, but that's an interesting note for SMB. Ultimately, do you agree that from a large enterprise perspective that's true? I mean, taking the practices and competence that Chris alluded to?
Yeah, I think there's, looking at what we do at SecureWorks, we have traditional delivered services into legacy data centers. And looking at how that needs to change for the cloud across the spectrum of large organizations to small, I think the answer to the more or less secure question is it can be more secure. I don't think it is yet. I see a number of places where there are not best practices defined, where there are cloud vendors that have no good answers to really key important questions like data deletion procedures and stuff like that. Really hard questions to answer. So I think the potential's there. I think Dev's answer was spot on in terms of large enterprise. Even with large enterprises, leverage is key. It's hard. There's negative unemployment in the security expert market today, and it's hard to find these people. It's hard to retain them. So if you can leverage them across the board more effectively, I think that makes a big difference. And cloud lets you do that.
I think the other interesting thing on the large enterprise benefit is the perspective you can gain, where you could only get that from a services provider in the past. You can now leverage cloud to provide additional global perspective on security and other big data analytics that you wouldn't have been able to do as an enterprise, even with the sizes of UBS and BMW and these kinds of organizations. You could still leverage and get additional global context by leveraging cloud services that will obviously inherently provide stronger security.
Well, speaking of those points, Regine was grimacing at me because I didn't make one conference call as a moderator, in which case I was supposed to know I was supposed to ask you this question. I knew what the question was, I just didn't know what was coming. So, to that point, if you would not mind, text the keyword that appears here to this number. And actually, if we think about the things that are not only missing, that were identified in some of the panelists' answers, but if you would think about kind of how the ODCA Security Working Group should focus their efforts, some of the stuff we just talked about, and we'll talk about more during the panel, are here. If you wouldn't mind kind of voting in terms of where you think we should invest our time, that would be fantastic. So your answers were kind of spot on, right? And if I summarize what I heard, you basically talked about the taxonomy of both market segment, small enterprise or small company, or large enterprise. But we've conflated as both an industry and from a marketing exercise the notion where cloud is absolutely everything, right? It's on-prem, off-prem, it's software, platform, and infrastructure as a service. And the difficulty is each one of those models has radically different sets of responsibility and accountability in terms of both where, what, how, and who is responsible for security. So a lot of times when we talk about cloud, and we'll kind of reference it here too, if we can be more specific about what kind, at least software, platform, and infrastructure, that would be useful. Because infrastructure, concrete to the hypervisor, the provider is responsible for a certain amount. The applications, the information, all the hard stuff still is up to the users. So, Dov, your notion of a smaller enterprise being able to leverage security capabilities of an infrastructure provider, that may work from the perspective of kind of blunt force trauma. What does it ultimately do to secure applications and information, right? So that's kind of what we're gonna dwell deeper on when we get into a little more of a conversational nature. But if you could take what you described as best practices and also think about the question I asked is it the right model? What really are the biggest differences between what we see in enterprise virtualized data centers, or even if you want to call it private cloud, and what are the key differences between, from a security perspective, that and we'll specifically say infrastructure as a service? So if you use Amazon Web Services, what's the biggest gap between what somebody does to secure their stuff in their enterprise versus, let's say, hosting the same identical app in AWS?
So look, I think the answer to that's probably data sovereignty. One of the big things most organisations which have which are regulated, most of the regulators are interested in where that data lives. Now, if it's outside of your country border, then there's government regulations that don't apply. And so, from that perspective, most organisations or most regulatory bodies need to ensure that that information is kept secure. And you can only confirm that, and you can only guarantee that if that's inside your country and more specifically inside your company's walls. So I think that's probably the biggest difference.
I agree. It's lying inside your sphere of control.
It's funny that the two guys with accents are the ones talking about data sovereignty.
Sorry.
Wait for the third, I guess.
I didn't think we had an accent over here.
No, yeah.
No, I think it's the fact that it lies within the control of your enterprise, and that for an enterprise is absolutely key. That the challenge is when you approach a cloud provider at the moment, you tend to have the tendency to say, okay, I can pass data over that I really don't need to have a strong control over. Pictures from a brochure that is already out in the public domain, that's okay, yeah, we can put that out there. I think the thing is the data that is regulated, the data that you need, your crown jewels within your organization, it's much less, companies are much less able to actually send that out because they don't feel that they have the relevant levels of control, of management, of visibility, and they don't have that comfort feeling around the use of the cloud today.
So to that point, though, and as the rest of the panelists answer, do you really think you have that much control? I mean, when you look at the lovely terms of shadow IT, DevOps, guys with credit cards that can spin up applications and show immediate value, highly regulated data or not, right? I mean, from the perspective of data sovereignty, forget territories outside of your national borders. Let's take a regional cloud provider. Do you really think you have control over that today as it stands?
From an official view, yes, of course we have.
Good answer.
From a realistic view for other companies, yeah, I doubt that would be true for as many people. But however, for every time that somebody goes out and spends money on their credit card, they're probably breaking a law somewhere. And the company then becomes liable for the breaking of that law, especially when you look around Europe and the privacy regulations that exist in law in Europe today. I can guarantee that companies that go outside and use such things as Salesforce are quite possibly breaking those laws.
That's an interesting topic. So, I mean, the impending security compliance regulatory apocalypse is coming then, huh?
It's going to be a fun discussion over the next couple of years.
It's interesting just on that point. One of the things I guess cloud provides or cloud apps provide is agility, right? And I can have, a business has a need. They can go out and buy that immediately. Most IT shops don't have the capability to react that quickly. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, with a credit card, I can spin up a complete new business unit in 30 seconds. And the IT shop, the security guys don't know it exists. Yeah. And that's a possibility that didn't exist 5 years ago. I think that's a really interesting challenge.
But to back that up, I think the key is that when they do that, as somebody mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, they'll then turn around 20 minutes later or a couple of days later and go, oh, excuse me, do you know if we break any laws doing this? Do you know if there's any audit points that we have to cover doing this? Do you know if we're okay? And eventually it comes back into the corporate IT.
Nice and polite, yeah.
The challenge is for me is that corporate IT and in their entity need to get the best parts of the cloud brought into the enterprise in a way that allows the agility, the speed of cloud provision, but maintains the rules, regulations, and everything else that we've grown up with in corporate IT security to bring both of those together. And I think that's one of the benefits for me of the ODCA. By bringing those requirements together, we can present those out to the provider world in a way that they can see them and understand them better.
Interesting. So guys, we're going to play like British Parliament. You actually don't have to go in order. So feel free to jump in, A, and B, you can throw things at each other. But so again, I'm going to ask you, Chris, or anybody else, to answer that last question within the context of what sounds like a horrible boat anchor of agility, right? Oh, we want to leverage cloud, but we want to be secure, and we want to take all these heavyweight processes and regulation. So from the perspective of what that means, does that explain the prevalence of why people are trying to stand up and replicate their own internal AWS clouds? And if so, are we really adding on, when we talk about the differences between virtualized data centers and cloud, even if you've got dynamism and self-provisioning, is that the right model? And ultimately, are the differences, are we trying to apply what we know just because that's what we know to a new model? And is that going to work?
It's not just about what we know, it's about what we're comfortable with. So I think the simple answer to the original question was it's all about physical access. And in the security game, physical access equals game over. And so enterprises have established mechanisms by which we trust the people who have physical access. We have them mostly as employees, or they go through some kind of screening processes. And there's more physical security around our data centers. And how do we get the equivalent level of trust with a service provider is a very gnarly question, because even for us to write down what we're doing for ourselves so that we can achieve equivalence is a hard problem. Mm-hmm. And Kurt asked the question at the beginning of today, who knows exactly what's in their data center right now? And barely anybody said, I know exactly what's in it. Do we know exactly who's in it as well? Is the ancillary question that goes alongside with that. Now, Kurt was also trying to say this kind of utopia of everybody flies through the same gateway and we get secure cloud-delivered services. But I think what we're hearing is we can't corral everybody through a single gateway. There's already stuff going on out there in the wild that somehow needs to be hauled back in on certain occasions to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So there's a problem around control, and it's a problem that's already existed in the enterprise, and it's just spilling out into a new context. And there are both opportunities and challenges here. People can see the opportunities of capital savings or greater agility in processes, but they're also having to deal with the challenges of, can I trust these people? Will my data be secure?
So we talk to folks all the time at conferences, and I spend my time actually attending conferences like developer conferences, which are kind of the known enemy of security if you were to read any kind of statements of fact relating to our relationship. And the interesting thing is you've got startups that are the size of small countries in terms of the amount of bandwidth that they use. If you want to pick a good one, Netflix is one. Takes up, basically accounts for a third of the internet traffic today. Relatively small number of headcount that from a company strategy perspective is all in from a cloud perspective, right? So their service delivery in many cases is using Amazon's cloud. They also have their own internal IT infrastructure that they're trying to push out. But this is a company that believes in not a centralized security team, right? Developers are accountable for security. We were talking about infrastructure as service in AWS, but as more and more things move up to a developmental paradigm where developers are writing code on platforms that aren't their own, the notion of what security means and who operates it and how it's implemented changes drastically. So I asked the question ultimately before, what's the difference between kind of enterprise IT and versus what you might put in Amazon? And now we look at things like platform as a service, where it's programmatically enforced security, or software as a service where you don't own any of the security except maybe entitlement. So what are the other things that are missing besides wanting to be a server hugger and reach out and touch your machines, right? Amazon's chief security officer, Steve Schultz, says that he doesn't even have direct access to AWS's data centers. He has to request that. So here's a security guy in charge of basically platforms that you run your apps and security on that doesn't even have access to his own infrastructure. So what other things are missing in terms of the difference between visibility, transparency, being able to reach out and touch your server? What else are we missing from the perspective of controls? And is it a maturity issue? Is it a fundamental paradigm change? Why the consternation?
So just on that point, I think one of the big changes, and I guess cloud is part of that, is the traditional design of security was your perimeter is where your security lives, right? So you've got firewalls, you've got IPSs, you've got WAFs, all sorts of stuff to protect your perimeter. And what's happening is when you're moving stuff out into cloud, that's not where the risk is. The risk is your database, your middleware. And so the challenge is how do you design and how do you build all that stuff from the ground up to be secure, because that's what it needs to be. And I think that's the big change. And from an enterprise perspective, that's a big way to go.
So it sounds like brownfield versus greenfield. I mean, an enterprise, right? 2,000 apps, 2.4 versions of each.
Yep.
The notion that if everybody could start from a clean sheet of glass, it would be much easier.
From our standpoint, it was interesting, as we started, 3 years ago looking at and leveraging cloud for the processing capability that we're able to stand things up and use it in that sense. There was, the two main points were reliability and complexity of processing that weren't able to be fully achieved in the cloud as we could leverage it. So we were doing, trying to do as much as we could, but there was just ultimately limitations of the cloud's capability to stand up components that we needed from our own complex infrastructure that we eventually had to pull it back in-house for some of the sensitive areas, but more so around the complexities of how we were leveraging sort of the data storage sets. The costs actually became more onerous and better effective keeping it inside.
So Mark, Greg, you guys ultimately work for companies that see a lot of other companies' data as it relates to security. You guys at SecureWorks do pen tests. McAfee has a whole set of services and solutions. What are the chief complaints when you talk to enterprises today? Is it, again, revisiting what we said here, is it visibility, is it transparency, lack of controls, maturity? What do you hear from the vendor side that gets asked about how enterprises should pursue security and compliance in the cloud?
It's interesting. The most common question I got at an event a few months ago was about helping organizations with their existing standards for how they deploy and secure applications. And it seemed like a really silly question, but what they stepped forward and said was, we've embraced corporate IT security standards, and everyone knows what that practice is for a physical server or a traditional user. And we really need your help in advancing our standards and practices on how we deploy that same level of protection and controls while leveraging cloud technologies, whether it be SaaS or infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. So I think it's one of maturity that we see very often, and it's not just maturity of the technologies, but maturity of organizations. the concept of the human issue. I can't fire someone at Amazon or any other cloud provider out there, but I can fire the IT guy that's going into the data center at the middle of the night. That's an issue. It's a maturity thing. How do you become comfortable as an organization with saying, I believe in their hiring practices, their firing practices, and I believe that they're going to do the kind of human audits that I need to have performed in the event that we have an issue. It's, from my perspective, a lot of organizations just tell us what the right things are, and that's why we spend a lot of time saying, this is the way you get the most efficiency, this is the most efficient way to deploy. The provisioning layer is new, right? And you think about controls around the provisioning layer and the auditability of provisioning. If you own the provisioning platform, you have pretty strong controls around that. If you don't own the provisioning platform and you don't hire and fire the person that runs the provisioning platform, you lose a lot of control whenever you move to the public cloud infrastructure.
I think a lot of these answers are foundationally the same thing. There is almost a diametrical opposition of agility and security controls. I mean, when I hear people talk about security as being the reason public cloud specifically, aren't adopted, what I hear is loss of control. I hear that I am essentially outsourcing some piece of my IT control to someone else. And you're right, I don't have the same controls over that. I don't have the same process. So if I am a mature organization and I do have mature security processes, I'm asking the question, how do I translate that into a cloud environment? So we get the same questions all the time. We get questions from customers, what are the best practices here? What should we be doing? And we have ranges of customers from people who have been doing everything in-house and are starting to look at cloud to organizations that have outsourced everything and are starting to look at cloud. And they're interestingly different questions there. But at the end of the day, I think there's this foundational tension between these two things. And when I go back to the first question about cloud more or less secure, I think cloud is introducing a level of lack of control that we just don't have good answers for yet.
Sounds like the shared responsibility model is difficult and interesting and challenging. Ultimately, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to cover two other things if we can talk about rapid fire answers. So assuming that we do our best work and we've deployed things that are as secure as we can hopefully get and are as compliant as we can hopefully make it. When something craps the bed, and that's a technical term, forensics and incident response, huge issue and element, or just same practices, nothing new to think about. If you guys can spend literally your most brief answer on that would be useful.
So, traditionally, for all that sort of forensic stuff is you need to have physical access to the device to get an image, right? In the cloud, you don't have that. So, I think that, from our perspective, that's an interesting challenge. We've actually got a usage model. I think that was one of the key ones that people were interested in. So, how do you create a forensically sound image in the cloud?
Especially with multi-tenancy.
Correct. Yeah. How do you do the disk? I don't know. Yeah.
If I look at it, I'm sitting in America in New York, and I look at the field of e-discovery. Mm-hmm. Very, very nightmarish when you're in a cloud. Yep. The federal government comes to me and says, "Can you give me some data?" Or a federal court comes to me and says, "Give me some data." How am I going to do that? Yeah? We need to mature the cloud provisions, even if I outsource and buy services in from someone else, which we do. Most companies, most large enterprises do it. So I outsource it. I can still deliver that because I still have that element of control. The challenge is moving that element of management and the ability to meet those forensic and e-discovery rules in the cloud where people go, oh no, you can't have control over it. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Huge issues until those are offered as automated services.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, great point. Chris?
So, again, it's about physical versus virtual. And we've come up with paradigms that are anchored in the physical world. The cloud doesn't work that way, so we need new paradigms.
Okay. Dov?
Definitely a game changer. In fact, in the last year, I've been on your side of the microphone, hosted probably 3 or 4 panels on incident response, forensics in the cloud. And usually I love to have a mix of enterprise users and different CISOs. Almost impossible to get anyone to say, hey, I want to be on that panel because you don't really know. No one's really done much work in that space. It's very difficult.
And when they do, they don't talk about it a lot, which is a problem. Information sharing and security is an issue.
So speaking as an MSSP and as a CSP, I think it's something that every customer should hold their CSP to. They should put their feet to the fire and say, you need to have an answer for this. You need to tell me how I'm going to get the data. You need to make sure that as an infrastructure provider, I can get access to your infrastructure logs that are relevant as well. Not just your logs, your images, anything that might be relevant to you. But we also have to make sure that you're not going to give me stuff that I shouldn't see. Yeah. And that's the really hard part of that is as a CSP, pulling out those bits that may or may not be necessary, and you don't always know, for an incident response or forensic analysis, but making sure that you only get the bits that are important. It's a really hard problem, but I think it gets solved when buyers demand it of CSPs.
Hey, Chris, two things we offered. We were going to, one, show the results of the survey, just so people can see what others in the room were thinking.
I don't have that button.
No, Krista.
Krista, got it. Sorry.
Bird. Which is interesting, since you were just mentioning e-discovery. Somebody quick text.
Yeah, so secure data deletion. Oh, e-discovery. Demigration and encryption.
I'll be there in a second.
Yeah, all right, quickly vote.
And then the other thing is we did want to open it up for 5 or 10 minutes to Q&A from the audience as well.
Well,
when you're done.
we got 2 minutes, or wait, no, 11:50. So we have so let me do that. So from the perspective of what you've heard here, does this based on you threw up your hands earlier? A lot of you were kind of IT related. How many of you have what you would classify as heavily regulated? I hate this word, but I'll use it anyway. Mission critical. Yeah, but you don't count. You're a service provider. No, I'm just kidding. Mission critical apps that you put in a public cloud provider, software platform, or infrastructure as a service. Show of hands. 3 brave souls. Yeah. All right.
I'd like to quantify is email mission critical?
It is, but I would like to turn it off. But if I do, I would be.
So with that in line is
how many of those apps are email? Financial? Okay, what are they? Shout. What kind of apps are they? I won't even ask your name, so don't be scared. Revenue producing apps. Yeah, that's important. Anybody else? Come on, there were 3 of you. Put your hands up. Training apps. Training? For internal employees, HR, that sort of thing, or technical training? Okay, so stuff. So he mentioned stuff that'll move the stock ticker. Training apps may not, right? And I think ultimately this gets to the point where a lot of companies are looking at a practice they've done for a long time with software as a service. People use Salesforce and CRM tools that has all their customer base in it, right? The companies that use Salesforce might consider that their crown jewels. It may not be intellectual property, but it's certainly important. Ultimately, you brought up the notion of kind of Intel, DoD, those sorts of applications, military applications where people's lives are on the line. I think ultimately what I heard from you guys is the notion that there are certain applications well suited for public-based cloud for a various set of reasons, a bunch that are good for internal private cloud. How many of you in the audience, and ultimately raise your hands on stage too, are looking at, we saw the keynote from the guy from Deutsche Bank who talks about this notion of hybrid cloud. How many of you, are trending towards the point of really thinking about how you... Wow, real time, awesome. E-discovery still are looking at this hybrid model between public and private-based clouds of any form. So then how many of you are doing nothing with cloud? Okay, so what's the gap in the middle exactly? Okay, how many are doing just private and all public? Okay, so mostly private-based clouds. All right. So ultimately, again, what about you guys? Hybrid? Private.
We're hybrid.
Hybrid.
I think you can have a mix without being a hybrid as well.
Okay, so define that. How can you have a mix without being a hybrid?
If you use something like a level of assurance model to decide where you're going to place workloads, you could say, okay, I'm going to put my high assurance workloads into a private cloud, and I'm going to put my lower assurance workloads into a public cloud. That might be a hybrid approach, but you're not using a hybrid cloud as people have come to understand that term.
Well, that's interesting because aren't the users of those applications potentially requiring federation? So is it the case of the user that defines the hybrid nature of it, or the fact that you're staring
it's not the user, it's the underlying data that's
the data
that's the driver for this.
And there's no commingling in these cases you're talking about. They're discrete data sets that don't ever bleed and touch each other?
They're bounded. And I think they're bounded in such a way that you've got a clear understanding of how data traverses between the bubbles.
I'm now moving from a moderator to a tormentor, by the way, just so you should adjust your model. All right. So from that perspective, when you think about whether you're doing a hybrid cloud in a structured approach or the fake answer that Chris just gave, when we think of the maturity of various practices or technologies, do we need standards in security or standards in cloud, and they're two different things, in order to make a secure cloud?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I give a one-word answer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, both.
No.
He just said that to be
He did.
to be
Which
controversial.
is good, thank God.
I'd say yes, but I give it a hesitant one because I want to see what that does to the.
All right. How about
To the
the audience?
industry.
Yes or no? Do we need cloud standards? Do we need cloud standards to be secure? Yes. Do we need Do we need security standards for cloud to be secure? Two different things. So you answered yes to cloud standards, but what about security standards? Because we don't have any. If you ask 5 vendors, we ask five different vendors, security vendors, to please go to a whiteboard and draw syntactically how to represent a 5-tuple ACL, right? Source, destination, so you'll get 5 completely different definitions of things we've been doing for 40 years. So
I was going to say that's the biggest problem with cloud today, right? You can't get a consistent definition of what is secure, and if I can't get the same answer from 3 different vendors, how do I know what secure is, right? So I think that's the biggest issue, and I think that the usage models we've been developing are trying to go some way to actually providing a minimum level, so I can say, well, this is kind of the area I'm after. This is what I need.
So you talk
But
about
that's not
a language of describing security state versus an actual set of standards that.
Requirements.
Okay, but that's two different things, right? I mean, the ability to say I'm at security level 3
Yep.
could be independent from 47 different technical standards of implementing security. So which are you advocating?
Yes. So I'm not saying this is what you must do to be secure. I'm saying here are the things you need to have to be secure.
All right, does that make sense to you guys? Yeah.
Yeah, you need to have achieved a level of security. You use the analogy that you posed a question earlier about what happens when people go out with their credit card and buy the stuff. Inside BMW, there's no way that I could go out with a credit card and buy enterprise solutions. They have to go through purchasing departments. Purchasing departments require 3 suppliers who offer the same service. 3 suppliers who I can compare in levels of security and say, go and choose one of those based on price. My purchasing department then go away and beat everybody up and come back with a very good price.
The ultimate bureaucracy machine.
That's how it works, though. That's the reality of large corporates.
Understood.
And the providers have to come together and give us, we'll guide them as the ODCA, but they have to come together and provide us that. Yeah, by all means, go above the standard. Offer your own better from that. There's no problem with that, but you have to provide us that minimum.
Greg, last comment?
I think the most fundamental basis for standardization should be how we characterize capabilities, both capabilities of systems as well as capabilities of the security that underlies or overrides those systems.
A parting thought, I mean, looking at the response to the survey, it's not just about the technology, but the operational stuff that lies behind that, where sometimes the greatest challenges lie. And one of the issues I've seen is often a service provider doesn't have the operational depth of the enterprise that wants to contract with it. And so, just things like shift rotors get in the way of capability.
Just from the earlier points, I think I hate for people to get confused between being compliant versus being secure.
Yep.
And I think that was kind of intertwined in this conversation.
So you answered no very, very quickly because we got no time. But you answered no that you don't need standards. Which one were you referring to? Technical standards or?
So I think that standards, yes, if you want to be compliant, but I don't think there's much around the security aspect. I mean, how secure are you is irrelevant of a standard.
Well, it's relative today because we don't have a way of describing it consistently. Yeah. Imagine if we could all say we could all raise our hand and have a badge that said what security level you are. That might be interesting and useful, besides compliant or not, which clearly, I mean, if you look at the breaches lately, you can be PCI compliant and still be breached every 10.5 seconds, right? So
Last comment, just I think there's certainly a need to be able to measure security levels, but I think that you need to leave the room for people to innovate underneath that.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it doesn't. So to that point, it seems security is won over usability, or seems to be won over agility, right? You heard a lot of kind of top-down, heavy process wanting to be attached to a very agile, nimble set of capabilities in cloud, whether that's even public or private. So I think that tension is the thing that is causing a lot of people to. We saw that we have public-only cloud apologists, right, who basically say the only true cloud and everything else is false cloud, is public-based cloud. Don't own any of your infrastructure. Some of those same companies, by the way, have thousands of VMs sitting on VMware in their data centers because they're heavily regulated, right? So there's that tension and balance. I think will work itself out. We see people that are now becoming compliant in the cloud because their auditors and the audit standards are starting to be kind of aligned to what this new technology is bringing to us, and operational models more specifically. And the guy who coined that phrase is sitting in the front row, James Urquhart, right? Cloud is an operationals model, not just a technology. We've gone through this before. I think what you've heard here is a really good balance of that tension between wanting to be agile and responsive, but being kind of layered down with what we have to deal with from a regulatory compliance perspective. I hope what you take away from this is a couple of elements around the fact that chart was literally in real time, kind of reflecting people's thoughts as they dwelled on the topic. But e-discovery was interesting, being a 0. So the notion of forensically securing cloud data, deletion is interesting, right? So that almost admits that the cloud is, the data is out there. So you want to be able to ultimately secure it under your control. You want to be able to definitely delete it. Kind of this notion of migration and encryption, they're all really intertwined. What's funny is the fact that we've ignored the portion that literally when something craps the bed, as I technically phrased it, the e-discovery and forensics and incident response is artificially low, probably because nothing's blown up yet for you. I think it would be right at the top when and if it did.
It could be a profile of the audience.
It could be a profile of the audience, yeah. So again, thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you guys for at least the 4 of you that answered the questions for putting up your hand. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you got something useful out of this. And with that, we shall end.
Have lunch.
Have lunch.